Hi, everybody. It's great to see you today. We'll probably have some stragglers and we'll let them in as they come in. We're recording and just wanted to let you know that. I'm Victoria Compton from the EDC director here. We've got some board members today, which is amazing. I want to give a shout out to them, and then I'll shout out to the staff and do a little public service announcement. We've also got James McCafferty from Western and Anneliese Vance-Sherman from the Employment Security Department, and Dr. Anneliese Vance-Sherman. So we'll do a little intro on them in a bit. Anyway, we're excited to be here today. This is our annual all data, all the time event, and it's something that we really enjoy here at the EDC because we can make more cogent decisions on the things that we do, and we're more able to meet the needs of our community by looking at data. And we get great data from Anneliese and from James. So thank you guys for coming today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn on my little slideshow and do a quick public service announcement of what we do here at the EDC. And then I'll immediately dive off and hand the mic and video capabilities over to James and Anneliese. So here we go. Thanks for coming today. Okay. Can everybody see that? Jillian, if you could nod, can you see that okay? Awesome, thanks. So the Economic Development Council, or the EDC, exists to help the community and build the economy of San Juan County. We look at workforce issues, business issues, and strive to answer the needs of our community. One of the things that we've been doing for an eternity is business support, including business workshops, individual support, and counseling. We work particularly post-pandemic on resilience, helping people build resilience in their businesses, retaining businesses that we've got, helping people expand their businesses. We do workforce development programs for the benefit of businesses, including job fairs, unemployment insurance assistance. We helped during the pandemic, certainly, and also during the catastrophic fire in Friday Harbor last year, helping the businesses and the community get stronger after that. We do, and we'll be starting again this upcoming year, launch San Juan Islands, which is a business plan competition. And last year we offered a business and hospitality management course to help people kind of gear up themselves into higher level positions in the businesses where they worked. We also do trades training programs, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Marty McConnell, our trades training coordinator.
Thanks, Victoria. Good morning. I have the privilege of coordinating trades training programs for the EDC. Programs include the home care aid training. We partnership with Peace Health and Cornerstone Healthcare training to provide training for our local residents who would like to help other neighbors of theirs stay home, and they would provide the home care for them. We have a merchant mariner credentialing program that helps support people who are interested in maritime trades, and financial and logistical support to help them through that process. And then we have a series of building trades programs, including construction introduction courses like masonry, welding, woodworking, and we are looking to do some auto and maritime trades training also, so that people have the ability to find a job that they love and make a good living wage in the community. We're working really hard in the youth trades program to introduce young people to trades opportunities, including woodworking right now, some metalworking, and working with 4-H and the high schools in the county. And AutoCAD is something that we're looking to add to our repertoire of classes soon, so that people can have some computer training in AutoCAD specifically that will help them in manufacturing or architecture, surveying, all sorts of trades and professionals that need AutoCAD training. And it's so far not available in the islands.
Thanks, Marty. Fantastic. On to Tech Training Initiative, and thank you everyone for listening to our public service announcement. We just try to get the word out about the work that we do here at the EDC, both to let you know And also sometimes after events like this, we have somebody send us an email or call us and say, you know, I heard about that program that you do in whatever, and I can help with that. So we're always excited to talk about what we do, both to let people know and to bring more people into the work itself. So I'm going to quickly hand the mic over to Jillian for a quick overview of her tech training initiative that we're doing here at the EDC.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. My name is Jillian Urbach, and I'm the tech training coordinator here at the EDC. We started our tech training initiative in May of last year and have offered several courses for both adults and youth on topics such as web development, web design. Our most current one is GIS. And the idea is it's kind of an extension of our trades training initiative, but focused more on trades in tech. So helping people either prepare for a career in the tech field or to help as tech support for local businesses. And the way we've been doing these courses so far is that they're online. People can complete the assignments on their own time at home, and then we meet weekly over Zoom for discussion, answering questions, and collaboration. And this format has allowed people from all the islands to participate as well. So it's really nice not needing to be there in person, which is something that COVID taught us was possible. So we'll continue offering courses like this. We've had almost 30 people complete our courses so far. So it's been really successful and we're excited to keep going.
Thanks, Jillian. Well, and I have to say the tech training initiative and trades too, all of those came from looking at the data, looking at gaps that were in the county, talking to businesses, learning more about what they needed and what was missing. So then the final piece of our puzzle is the advocacy and community building that we do, connecting our community to the people and the resources who can help us get stronger, connecting our businesses to agencies and leaders, and then advocating for our island's businesses and workers. So that is the puzzle of the EDC in one quickly spoken nugget. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to James McCafferty and Anneliese Vance-Sherman. Dr. Anneliese Vance-Sherman, why don't you go ahead and kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and, oops, sorry, I think I accidentally just muted you as you were unmuting yourself. I just did it again. Sorry about that. So go ahead there, Dr. Vance-Sherman, thank you.
Yeah, Victoria doesn't actually want to hear from me today.
No, I totally do. You're the best.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here virtually with you today. My name is Anneliese Vance-Sherman. I'm a regional labor economist with the Employment Security Department. The role I play is basically connected to primarily what we do. So the Employment Security Department has a number of different functions, including unemployment insurance and mandatory partners in the workforce development systems around the state. I work in a small division, the data division, that it has the Bureau of Labor Statistics contract for labor market information. So I am working very closely with the people who collect, analyze, and publish labor market data, such as wage information, industry trends, and unemployment rate for the state as well as for BLS. I'm glad to be here with you today, and I will hand this off to James McCafferty.
You know, this is it's more fun when we do this in person because we can actually point at each other and use a nonverbal cues. But I know it's like I don't know which way to point. So good morning, James McCafferty. I am director of the Center for Economic Business Research at Western Washington University, and our center produces a number of reports for places around the state, as well as government agencies and nonprofits and tribal communities. And even some companies get into the fun with data. So we do a lot of applied research, as well as creating some economic forecasts for the region and other fun tidbits that get us into good data. And so we're looking forward to a groovy conversation today with you. So I'll have to drive here. So let's just start with some quick notes about getting ourselves organized a little bit here. We're going to start out with some observation notes from both Anneliese and I. We're going to go through some outlook notes. We're going to dive into the labor market, and we're really hoping to have a lot of discussion today. And so use your chat box. That's the easiest way. But if it's one of those things where it's complex, you can definitely talk to us. It's not it's not that kind of show. You get to talk if you need to. So don't be shy. Ask questions, and even if it's something we can't get into today, we will get you back whatever you're looking for in life. So that's what we do. So we've made it really easy for you to know which one of us is responsible for each slide. So we're using lots of different slide formats. So this wasn't out by accident. I always tell people when they're learning how to use PowerPoint, random is not a actual preferred layout, but you're going to see that both Anneliese and I have dedicated slides, and that's just so you know which organization is producing what. And then Anneliese and I are going to badger each other a little bit as we go through here and hopefully ask some of the questions you're too timid to ask as you look at data as well. So again, we want you to have some fun. So I'm going to start with some key observations. I have when people say, what's going on with the economy? First of all, it's like being an economist for the last few years has been like the weatherman, probably, or the weather person last night talking about all the snow, right? It's really exciting. People are excited. There's lots to talk about. And so there's just some key things that I'd like you to kind of park in the back of your brain as you think about the economy. And so it's critical to unpack the economy, right? So what is the economy? Well, it depends on how we're going to frame that discussion, but we can talk about geographics, right? So global, national, regional. We can talk about demographics, household income, gender, race, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about by sector, manufacturing, service, or even getting more granular into very specific industries and looking at or particular occupations. And so what the challenge is for you as a general consumer of data that is often not exactly the most clear thing in the world, you have to consider what could be influencing or be a factor that's influencing and be impacted by the things that you're looking at. So my best example of this is most of you probably have not paid attention to the commodities market by itself very well. You've thought about things about gas and you've thought about things like that, but it really hasn't been highlighted as much as supply chain or labor market. Those are things that people get really excited about. When I start talking to you about wheat futures, you're probably going, I'm sorry, what are we talking about? But wheat futures are a big deal. And Ukraine has a very big backstory on why wheat futures are going up again, which means that prices at the grocery store are going to be impacted again. And so commodities market is actually probably one of the least talked about, but one of the most important things I keep coming back to with people. So we are at the beginning stages of many significant global to regional changes that are going to have long-term implications. Population average age is increasing globally and also within different countries at different rates. We have negative birth rates in some countries. We have climate changes that are going to have a variety of impacts, including today, the price of margaritas is going to be going up, folks, because we have a problem with bats. And so again, these are really weird nuances that are really going to be significant down the road. And then we can get into migration pattern changes, and we can talk about in the microcosm and just talk about metropolitan areas here in the region, but we can also look at the United States or globally and how those are impacting and how that's going to impact the economy in general as well. Consumer expectations, that's your fault. They're influencing the market more than it's considered by most as well. And so we're getting a lot of market fluctuations through shifts in consumption patterns, sometimes based on perceptions, but also sometimes just based on household patterns that are emerging and changing. So Home Depot and Walmart this week said they're very concerned, their sales are very flat, but other sectors are seeing big increases in sales, right? So we know that consumer spending on a whole is increasing, but not steadily through all sectors. And so these are all just some basic key observations I'm going to offer. Anneliese?
All right, thanks, James. I think of some of the comments that we've been seeing. So thinking about the labor market, right now we're hearing the word labor shortage a lot. And I would, if I could see everybody, I would ask for a show of hands if labor shortage is kind of what's on your mind right now, not being able to find workers. And generally speaking, every audience I've spoken with over the last year, that has been major concern and really forefront. But when we think back to just 2-3 years ago at this point, what was the major concern? Pandemic. We were having record high unemployment rates, and now we're looking at record low unemployment rates in the space of 2-3 years. It's been crazy. I mean, it's really, who would have thought that we would have been having the conversation right now when we were all going into lockdown? So the way I've been visualizing this is kind of like you drop a pebble in the water and you've got that initial splash, and then you've got that amplified those ripples that happen, and they are really large and noticeable at first, and then they start to kind of normalize. Right now, the story that I'm going to be focusing on is going to be on the labor market, particularly what are the contributing factors to the labor shortages that we have right now, and how did we get here from 2 years ago having the opposite problem? I'll be focusing on what that looks like in terms of the unemployment rate, the size of the labor force, the number of job openings, quits rate, layoff rate, wages, how these all kind of fit together. And we'll see that this is a really tight reinforcing story, but some of the data behind it might not be obvious. Next slide. The other thing to be thinking about, and that's really at the heart of this, is the question of labor force participation. Why do we have why are we talking about labor shortages? Well, it's high demand, and in terms of labor, less supply. And so we need to be thinking about what are those short-term effects? What got disrupted or broken by COVID that's new and novel, and we're getting through and disrupted the labor force participation rate? But what are the things that we've been talking about for decades? What are the demographic shifts that have been slow coming? And what are some of those structural barriers, such as childcare, that we've been talking about for decades, only now it kind of got shaken up, and it might be a little bit of a different shade of the same color. But nonetheless, some of this is not new. It's just looks a little bit different. We're thinking about it in a different way. Next slide. And back to James.
I wasn't ready. Okay, so let's talk about some outlook notes. So think of this like forecast, things to think about when you think about what's ahead, the crystal ball, so to speak. I didn't bring any of my props to use for this show today. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is retail sales. So as I mentioned, retail sales are being heavily influenced by consumer confidence. And what's interesting when we unpack consumer confidence is that what we're seeing a lot in the data from people is not necessarily they're concerned, they're more concerned about holistically. And so we've paraphrased that as, I'm okay, but I'm concerned about my neighbor, therefore I'm changing my behavior. And that's problematic. Because if people's expectations is that the economy is going to get worse somehow for them, then they're going to behave in a way of resource scarcity, which can actually create the problems they're afraid of. So the mix of retail sales is also critical here. So food service actually drove the largest piece of the latest increase. So these two charts I have over here, the top one shows the change from the prior month in retail sales. And so you can see that, and they combined, I found fascinating when they brought this out, is they combined retail with food, which is not always presented that way. So I thought that was interesting. And then I saw the breakout, and it dawned on me why they presented it this way. Because as you can see, dining out had a remarkable increase. And this is national data, followed by autos and parts. Okay, furniture, which I found fascinating as well, since most of y'all bought a lot of furniture in the last couple of years. So to see furniture sales going up, it makes me wonder what kind of furniture people are buying now, because it's not patio furniture. And so again, looking at this data, I'm looking for the story of how these things are going to be impacting in the year ahead. And again, I mentioned Home Depot and Walmart are expecting flat-ish sales in the next 12 months. So then we look at real estate, and real estate's been fascinating to talk to you, because there's a lot of people freaking out about real estate. And real estate's really more of a story of a return to, and I put this in quotes, normal. What's normal? More of a return to normal than a bubble or a collapse. And so as the rates have gone up, there is a mathematical connection between rates, income, and house prices, right? Because you have to be able to afford the house. And so it's math. And we all know everyone loves this kind of math. A little algebra, lots of letters and variables. And so as we raise rates, it puts more pressure on either you have to have more income, or the price of the house you're going to buy has to go down so that you can get the mortgage price that you can actually afford. Well, okay, so if we look at the charts, that's exactly what we're seeing in the data that even came out today. We're seeing the housing market kind of return back to trend as far as volumes go. And that's a really good sign in reality, because part of what's been driving this huge run up in prices of homes is a limited supply. And we still have a very limited spot. We've got a long way to go, folks, before we get to where the market flips to, oh, it's a seller's market, it's a buyer's market. We have a long way to go before we go to it's we have way too much constrained inventory to worry about houses having to be sold for a bargain to be competitive in the market. But prices do have to become more aligned with what people can actually afford. And so people aren't seeing the kind of raises in prices, and perhaps their dreams and ambitions are doing that. Commodity prices, again, my friend, the commodity market, they are seriously impacting the housing market, right? And they've done it in very uneven bits and surges. Lumber's up 200%. Lumber's back down to where it was. Lumber's up 150%. Lumber's down 30%. I mean, it would be fun to actually get one of those cameras on the price of 2x4s at your local lumber place, because the price has changed remarkably at the retail level, let alone at what a contractor is buying to build a house. And so thoughts of this really depend on what aspect of real estate you're considering. Are we thinking about single family home, multifamily home, commercial, industrial, right? I mean, we got a lot of, so again, when someone says real estate, ask them to unpack what they're talking about. Because that's going to help you understand what kind of forecast we should be thinking about in those terms.
Can I just jump in really quickly and point out that population is going to have a big piece of this too, when we're thinking about who needs to buy housing and why. That question of whether this is a bubble or a collapse, I agree with James that a lot of this is sustained by people that genuinely are building, are looking to move out of their parents' house, looking to, have their own secure housing. And it's not so much of a bubble as real demand in place right now.
So then we look at inflation. Inflation is one of those great things. I hear a lot of questions about inflation from folks. And so inflation sources are really the challenge when we talk about inflation. So we have supply chain issues from a war to bird flu. I mean, like, this is a confluence. Like, I don't even know how you'd write a movie script with this many villains. We have so many things that are impacting the shelf price, or whatever, however you want to think about prices, and do that. We also have a shift in consumer preferences and consumer expectations, and how we measure it is also a challenge. And so when we talk about inflation, I try and get people to unpack a little bit about what are we really talking about? Are we talking about the price of eggs? Are we talking about your total grocery bill? Are we talking about CPI? Are we talking about PCE, or whatever other acronym I want to throw at you, right? What are we talking about? Because it depends on how I want to talk to you about that. So this top slide here is the consumer price index. The weakness to CPI is this. When you go to the grocery store, if something is really expensive, you might decide to use a substitute good, right? You might use the store brand instead of the name brand. You might use a different kind of whatever. CPI assumes you always buy the same thing no matter what. So there's no consumer preference in the CPI model. PCE actually, which is what the Fed uses to set rates, different metric, different methodology, does allow for some preference setting. And so again, the metrics matter, but at least it's consistent, right? So even though the thermometer may be broken, at least it's consistent. And so you know if something's awry. What's down in the bottom left-hand corner here, we have contributions to inflation. So again, just like I unpacked the other slides, a few slides back, what is it that's driving inflation? And when we look at this, it's really interesting. So you have this other core, right? And you can Google and get a list of what's in all these things. I won't bore you with that. But you can see what's actually driving inflation. So food, yes, a little bit. Energy was a big spike, and now it's come back down. And again, energy has more to do with Ukraine than any other factor. And so, so that's kind of settled back down, at least for the time being. We have core less energy services and shelter. That's definitely come up a little bit. So you're looking for trend, right, across these years and patterns to understand what shifts, so that you can kind of go in and say, okay, but what is that exactly? And then you can go in and look at that. And then what's the last visual I have here is U.S. consumer expectations. Remember, I told you you're worried about your neighbor. When I look to ask people, what's your expectation for inflation in the next year? I get this huge spike. Oh, inflation's going to be crazy pants. But in 3 years, oh no, it'll be fine. Right? It's like, okay. All right. So there's a lot of expectations that are manifesting themselves into behavior, and that again can be a problem. Migration and population challenges. So this global movement of people and workforce needs are something that is really got my attention right now. And within the US, where people are choosing to work and live has also got my attention. So if I look at this top slide or top picture here from Brookings, that's migration rates within the United States by type of move, right? So this goes from 2005. If you've got a small screen, you're squinting, it's okay. Just look at the shapes, it's fine. But the first one there is with people moving within their own county. And so you can see that's declined quite a bit. Like just historically, we've seen that drop. And that's not, again, coming into the pandemic, we already were seeing that happening. Did it accelerate? Yes, but it's not unusual. It follows a trend. Across counties has gone up. We actually have seen a lot of people move counties. So King County is a great example. You've probably seen headlines, oh, people are moving out of Seattle. Yeah, they're moving to places like Everett and Woodinville and Bothell. In fact, an overwhelming percentage of people that have moved out of Seattle have moved to the suburbs. That's that middle chart that you're seeing there. And then you have, oh no, everyone's moving to Idaho. Well, maybe not. That's that last bundle of decks there. We haven't seen a huge increase across state lines. So again, right, perception versus reality as far as migration. And what does this mean for workforce? If we have less people inside the city of Seattle, what does that mean for employers? What does that mean for places like San Juan? And does it give you the ability to have people work, live remote? And what's that mean for your economy if you've got people with high wage Seattle jobs moving into your community? What does that mean? The other thing that's really kind of interesting is we're getting older as a global community. And so the share of populations age 65 and older. So this pushes out to 2100. I don't know about you all, but I don't plan on being here at that point. But at 2100, look at the share of people that are expected to be out of the workforce, but consuming resources, right? And spending dollars and doing things. This becomes a challenge when we think about who's going to be actually providing the services and goods that these people are going to be consuming. Is that robots? Is it, what is it that's going to help us allow for that kind of behavior?
All right, looks like I'm up. So the story I'm going to be talking about right now is looking at Washington State and then focusing in on San Juan County when the data is available. That is sometimes a challenge, just the availability for small counties such as San Juan County. But looking at overall what the last couple of years have looked like. And so this first slide looks at Washington State total employment from 1990 to 2022. And what we can see is that during, I'm going to call this demand. For all intents and purposes, this is an illustration of demand. Truly, it is where demand and supply meet because it's number of jobs, but you'll see why I'm doing this in the next slide. What we can see is that during recessions, we have a drop in actual number of jobs. And then we see that overall wave-like pattern that economists love predictable wave-like patterns, I will tell you. And that has been one of the challenges with a lot of our data lately. But what happens in 2020 is highly unusual. In fact, if I was to take this at a national level and scale it all the way back to, I believe this one goes back to 1939, you'd see the same wave-like pattern, and then 2020 just stands out. Completely unusual time in our history. During this time period in Washington State, we lost about 6 years worth of job growth. This took us back to the same levels we were at in 2014. And just a really remarkable moment in time. And if I was looking at this data without context, I would wonder what happened to the data, what broke it. But what I'll draw your attention to is what happened afterwards. We saw a remarkably sharp recovery. In fact, if we can call the same number of jobs that we had going into the pandemic recovery, then by that measure, we recovered this year. In 2020, 2022, we had recovered all of the jobs. Not the same jobs, but the same number of jobs total that were lost during the pandemic. Really a remarkable recovery. And especially in these early months, you can see an extremely sharp V-shaped recovery. This is when PPP loans were getting pushed out. This is when we were all figuring out, okay, if we wear masks and we socially distance and follow regulations and watch out for health, just a lot of things happening, and we innovated a lot and figured out how to get through this. So really a remarkable recovery. But what we can also see is that demand for jobs came screaming back. We had a lot of money circulating in the economy, and demand came back really quickly. Next slide. And in San Juan County, San Juan County is a little tough. I have not seasonally adjusted data. You can see it's really more of a seasonal rhythm that drives growth in San Juan County, but you can also see here in 2020 and 2021, a bit of disruption. That pattern kind of gets off a little bit. So it was definitely felt in San Juan County that seasonality got disrupted. Here's summer of 2020. So just about the same as winter of 2019. So the seasonality is still there, but it's gotten a little bit rocky. Next slide. Okay, so shifting to the supply side, when we're talking about the labor market, of course, the supply side is people that are able and available to work. And so what we see is a little bit of a different pattern. Whereas we saw that wave-like pattern where demand would wax and wane over the course of economic cycles, labor force is more connected to population than anything else. So it tends to be a lot more steady, much more steady line. So people are more likely to be perhaps stepping over that line between employed and actively seeking employment, which we call unemployed, but they're still in the labor force for the most part. We see a little bit of a pause during most recessions, just a little tiny bit of a pause, but generally not an actual hollowing out until we get to 2020. The labor force itself dropped, even though population growth was still happening. You'll notice the recovery takes a bit of a different form. It was not that sharp V-shaped recovery, much more of a U-shaped recovery, which means it took a while longer for us to have the same number of people in the labor force as we had before. So if you can call recovery the same number of people that were in the labor force prior to the pandemic recovery, then we recovered in 2022. But we had more population growth. We still continued to grow as a population, which means that there is a significant gap. Labor force participation actually has decreased, decreased sharply, and then a little bit, came back a little bit, but definitely not a bounce back in the same way that we would have expected normally. So that's kind of the story, and that's what brought us to where we are today. Demand came back much more quickly than supply. Next slide.
Anneliese, before I let you go, when you talk about population, the general population number, everyone's like, oh, well, we have, whatever, how many people live in our community, that's fine. But then you have a number of those people that are actually in the workforce, right? And that number seems to be fluctuation within the ratio there, right?
Well, that's what this is looking at. Way earlier, I had labor force participation rate slide that kind of showed a significant drop, but then coming back somewhat. Labor force participation is absolutely tied to demographics. We have been seeing labor force participation on a slow decline since the 1990s as we get older. Kind of a nod to James's earlier slide about suggesting retirement playing a role. This is the one slow moving piece that we could have seen coming 20 years ago, knowing that we have a very large generation entering retirement at this point. This accelerated that a little bit, and I think this is really interesting, labor force participation for age 55 to 60 actually rebounded, is actually a little bit higher than it was going into the pandemic, which suggests people are not necessarily retiring earlier on average. This is looking at aggregate statistics, but it's just a lot of people retiring right now. And then we've got a very small generation, Gen Z, the kids of a very small generation, Gen X, entering into the workforce now. So there are going to be a lot of structural challenges just related to that population. So we can bring this down to look at the number of people that are within normal working age. And we do know that one of the pieces is absolutely retirement, but there are a lot of other pieces at play too. All right, looking at San Juan County, similar kind of pattern to what we saw before, just very sharp seasonality that got disrupted a little bit during the pandemic. But as a whole, we're not seeing as high of a spike in the size of the labor force in the summer. What this suggests, and you all know the dynamics of your economy better than I do. I know that what the numbers tell me. But from conversations I've had, I know a lot of people will spend the summer in San Juan County and they live elsewhere for the rest of the year. And we're seeing fewer people, a smaller labor force the past couple summers. And so that's this is how that shows up in our data. Right, next slide. The unemployment rate, cannot give a presentation without showing the unemployment rate. What we can see overall, of course, with that seasonality, the seasonality has been declining a little bit. You can see back in the 90s, just very high amplitude, but reducing a little bit over time. San Juan County's unemployment rate reached 19.2% in April of 2020, compared to Washington State as a whole, 16.8%. And then has dropped pretty similarly to the state. At this point, the state is at 4.4% and San Juan County is at 3.9%. So very low unemployment rate. What this tells us is that generally speaking, job seekers are connecting with work. If you are able to work, if you are actively seeking employment, you're probably successfully finding employment. And as a whole, we're seeing this in Washington State as well as San Juan County. Now, one thing I want to point out about the data in general, I'm going to kind of pause. We are going through our revisions right now in where we sync up our data with BLS, and we do major revisions at this time of year. So the story as of March 7th could change significantly. And so I do want to give that heads up that we might see some major shifts, especially affecting smaller counties like San Juan County, because we have smaller samples. So I'm telling you the truth as we know it in this moment, but those numbers do shift as we get more information and as we go through our benchmarking processes. So there's my disclaimer that applies to all of my slides. Next slide. All right, a couple things that we've been seeing and hearing about in the news, and just as James pointed out, there are some moments in time when we hear about certain economic indicators that might be new to us, and others might be taking the back seat. And lately, if you've been listening to the news, you've been hearing all about high quits rates. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? In Washington State, this data is for Washington State, published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics from a series called JOLTS. And just a couple things I want to point out. One, job openings, that dark blue line up towards the top. The number of job openings has hit record levels. Now, this is where that dropping that pebble kind of comes in. You can see that significant drop in the number of job openings in 2020, and then a rebound as business starts to come back, as we start to see, high demand for workers. We see a number of job postings. And it is coming down, but we're still in historic high territory in terms of the number of job openings. That's going to affect that green line, quits. Fundamentally an optimistic measure. When we're talking about quits, people don't quit their job if they're worried about getting their next job. They'll wait until they're feeling good about their job prospects and that there's a safety net for them. And with a record number of job openings, yeah, people are taking their chances. And so we see elevated quits rates. Yes, it's beginning to calm a little bit, but still, if I was to draw this out, you'd see it's a historically high level of quits as well. So these come together. And when I talk about all these different metrics coming together and telling a story about a strong labor market, these are a couple of those pieces. I'll also point out layoffs and discharges. This is involuntary quits. And right now we're pretty much at historic lows. In fact, if we look at unemployment insurance claims, we're back about where we were in 2005. And this is number of claims, not rate. Even though we've had population growth, significant since 2005, we're still looking at about the same level of layoffs. beginning to climb a little bit, but nothing significant at this point. So all these narratives really coming together, all this data kind of reinforcing the story about a strong labor market.
Anneliese, the person in the back of the room is shaking their head, and they're like, I read today that Meta / Facebook / whatever they're going to call themselves next week, they're laying off 1,000 more people, and Microsoft, the sky's falling in the tech sector. What say you?
I have some slides to talk about that, but I guess I'll talk about.
No, I'll wait. I'll just tell the person in the back they can wait, but I think that's it'll be fun to have that discussion.
That's going to be a discussion. And in fact, I'm not going to be able, that's going to be something to talk about. And so let's put a pin in that, because that's going to be a tough one to measure. All right, next slide. San Juan County generally has a low unemployment rate, even during the winter. As we have, this is largely, just like James was pointing out, with a lot of economic data, it's about expectations. If people don't think in a seasonal economy like San Juan County, you might know this is just not the time of year for the type of job you're looking for, so you don't look. So you're not in the labor force. You're not going to contribute to that unemployment rate. 3.9%, really low unemployment rate. When you look around the state, generally speaking, low unemployment rates, the lowest tend to be in that I-5 corridor, specifically in the Puget Sound area. Because it's about connectivity, not necessarily job creation, but how well people are able to connect to jobs. And when you've got good broadband, when you've got redundant roads and transportation systems and a lot of social networks, easier to find those matches. So that's geographically how that plays out. Next slide. All right, different industries impacted differently. This is Washington State. I'll show you why I choose to focus on Washington State when I show you the San Juan data that bounces around a lot. But as a whole, we can see there are a lot of different experiences depending on which industry you're in. And so I'm not going to go through each and every one of these. I'm going to go through a couple key outliers. James, next slide. So the way to look at these slides is I've taken each major industry sector, called February of 2020 100% employment, and then just let it play out from there. This has been my roadmap through the entire pandemic, and as I add month by month to this slide. So a couple outliers at the lower end, those industries that struggled the most and are continue to struggle. The largest outlier, the one that signifies this particular pandemic recession more than any others, leisure and hospitality. Of course, in San Juan County, this is major industry in San Juan County. These are restaurants, hotels, entertainment venues. Started to drop even before any of the other industries began to drop, and saw that drop about 40%. Really large industry statewide, especially in San Juan County, that lost about 40% of all jobs in the space of 2 months, and has been seeing some significant recovery. You can still see waves of COVID when you look at how bumpy that recovery has been. But that dark blue line is close to where we were prior to the pandemic, but this is close to where we were 3 years ago, even though we have a growing population. So a couple different things happening. This is an industry that has had a number of different challenges, a remarkable recovery, all things considered. But a lot of our habits have changed. The way we consume things changed. I can speak for myself and say I don't eat out at restaurants as much as I did in 2019. Some of our habits have shifted over time, and that has presented a challenge, especially for industries that rely on face-to-face interactions, such as leisure and hospitality. Other services also within that's that rust-colored line that drops and then just kind of stays there. This is our dry cleaners, our hairdressers, our auto mechanics. I've done dry cleaning once in the past 3 years because I just don't need to wear suits as much as I used to, right? So it really speaks to how our habits and our daily rhythms have shifted over time as well. Yes, and I see, John, you've got the question about which industries have gone above pre-pandemic, and that is going to be the next slide. But not yet. James, go back. Another industry I want to point out is manufacturing, the red line here. Manufacturing, of course, in Washington State, very diverse set of industries, but dominated by aerospace. And we saw a lot of very large and high profile, well-documented layoffs from Boeing and others in the supply chain in 2021. So that had a little bit of a delayed impact. And that's beginning to recover, but again, this is another industry that has struggled and particularly impacts the Puget Sound area. Okay, next slide, James. Thank you. At the other end, we've got a lot of industries that bounced back fairly quickly, and a couple that I want to point out. First of all, most of these lines that are above the white lines that I have kind of grayed out are a lot of industries that have a lot of their workforce able to do their work from home. So these are industries that were able to utilize technology and recover much more quickly because they never lost their workforce in the first place. But I think the best example is the information industry. The information sector includes software publishing, largely centered in King County, but you can see this dark blue line that just barely misses a beat. This was a high growth industry going into the pandemic and accelerated into the pandemic. Why? Number one, they didn't have to lose their workforce. They were able to send their workforce home and didn't have to go through losing and then rehiring their workforce. But second, we used their products and services more than ever. Every single industry was tapping into these services so that they could get their, get their employees geared up to be able to work from home, to be able to set up different kiosks and online delivery, a number of different types of ways of doing business. So the information sector kind of saved us, really, really grew. I'm also going to say for play. My kids played way more video games than I have ever allowed them to play during the pandemic. Now we're trying to disinvest. Oh, yeah, see that drop? This is me. This is me telling my kid he cannot buy more Facebook or more Fortnite skins. This is, we are not needing to, my company, the Employment Security Department already put everything on my laptop, all the security, all of the software that I need in order to be here with you virtually. They don't need to buy that all over again. They just need to renew licenses at this point. So the demand has softened. And we're seeing that play out when we're talking about these tech layoffs. Demand was absolutely robust, absolutely there. I do not think it was a bubble, but it has softened because it kind of met its natural saturation point. That's kind of how I'm seeing this at this point. The other thing I'll point out is when you look at the data for some of our high-tech sectors, which, by the way, show up in a lot of different industries, even though we're seeing some drops, and we're not really seeing them yet, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, there's still year-over-year growth. This has just been a very high growth industry. A couple other sectors that I'm going to point out really quickly, that light blue line that drops and then kind of comes back pretty quickly, that's retail. Retail's very diverse. So if you're a clothing retailer with a storefront, you might have a very different experience than a grocery store because we were not eating out as much as we used to. We were buying more groceries. Building supply stores as well came back really quickly, and Amazon. When we're talking about retail trade, we're also talking about online retail, and we shifted some of our buying behaviors. And in Washington State especially, that really shows up in our retail data. And I know, I bought a lot of things that came in brown paper boxes, and I know everybody else did too because I've seen the data. One other industry I'll point out really quickly, this red line that's kind of like a check mark, that's our construction industry. We usually watch construction as a bellwether. When construction starts to drop, we think, oh no, we brace ourselves because this is it, demand is drying up. But no, they needed to be back at work yesterday. This is an industry that is no stranger to PPE, and they got back to work really quickly, buoyed by a strong housing market. Construction actually is one of our top performers as well. All right, next slide. This is San Juan County. This is a product of seasonality. This is also a product of small samples. So it's messy. And this is why I don't tend to focus on small counties in this data. But what I will point out, when we do look at this data, it's normalized the same way. So assuming that we don't have major disruptions with our benchmarking process, what I will point out is that for the most part, you can see that leisure and hospitality bounces around a lot. You can see the seasonality got disrupted a little bit, But you can also see that for the most part, San Juan County is above that line, can be considered recovered in industries other than education and health services that kind of hollowed out towards the end. I guess one other thing I'll point out is that this is not atypical. So looking at which areas around the state recovered more quickly than others, there's a short-term view and there's a long-term view. Short-term view is that our more rural areas throughout the state recovered more quickly from 2020 to 2022. A lot more concentration of essential services in smaller areas. And so these tended to recover more quickly, generally speaking. But when we take that long run view, the smaller counties also tend to be the areas that had slower growth recovering from 2008. So San Juan County fits in with what we've been seeing in a lot of smaller counties in Eastern Washington in particular, but there has been kind of that question of, do you focus on the short term? Do you focus on the long term in this moment in time? Okay, next slide.
And I think let's take a break. So let's talk about the projections, right? So you saw the data where the data really is. So let's talk about what we're seeing in the next couple of years ahead. So assuming we see this continued recovery, and I'm starting to drop this continued recovery from COVID and just start assuming we see continued economic expansion, because that is indeed what we're seeing. And somewhat general stability. Those are two big ifs, right? Let's assume both those things happen. What we would expect to see in San Juan County in the next 2 years is around 2,000 jobs come open. So you're seeing people move around in positions, and about 126 or so. And again, I like precise numbers, but squint a little bit. Around 120 to 130 new positions that are requiring people that are not in those industries moving around inside the industry. So not a ton, but also pretty typical. Those are your when I look back at years past, that's normally what we've seen. Your high growth industries, so 62% of those new positions, and the new positions will be in these spaces. 41% of all your positions are in these industries, but healthcare and social assistance, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation and food service, and information is where we're seeing the high growth of those occupations that go in there. Industries with negative growth, and both these are really small. So I almost didn't include this slide, because utilities are actually forecasted a very small decrease around the entire state. That's not, and I think it was like 1 job or 2 jobs in San Juan. It wasn't a huge number, but I think it was 1 actually, now I'm thinking about it. But statewide, I'm seeing that same projection around the different counties around the state, which makes me wonder if not what we're seeing here is realities of a smaller workforce more than in ratio of everything, rather than actual reductions in workforce over the by choice, like reductions by business choice. So again, really small. I wouldn't ponder these very far, but it's worth noting at least that they're not expected to grow. And retail for me was fascinating, because retail is where we're seeing a lot of growth, but also a lot of struggle in the labor market. And so there's some interesting thoughts perhaps around why San Juan might be transitioning in some way that's affecting your retail workforce. And again, looking at the seasonality and the shifts in the seasonality may be part of that explanation.
Can I jump into the question about retail trade briefly? As a whole, what we've seen is, when we're looking at our data right now, the year over year is usually where I'd like to look as opposed to month to month. But year over year doesn't really tell us the context of the past couple of years. So we are seeing statewide and in all of the counties that I cover, for the most part, that flat or reduced employment level in retail. But that's coming off of a time of really high retail growth because we've shifted our pattern. So is that really signifying a decline, or is it more of just an adjustment off of a really high period of growth? I think that's really important when we're looking at recent data or trying to project that forward, that it is coming off of a highly unusual time.
Yeah, for sure. And again, why I I almost didn't include it because it's just like it's worth knowing, but it's not worth losing any sleep over from that perspective.
But it's also worth, when you're looking at those monthly numbers that come out, recognizing that, yeah, it's a drop, but look at what it's coming off of longer.
Right. Exactly. So I put together an industry cluster map. These are kind of fun to look at, and for most people, they're like, "What's going on here?" So I want you to go back to your geometry class where they touch a landscape inside of charts. Look for in the lower scale. Look for the zeros. That point, you're going to draw a line there. And if this is what's fun about doing this on Zoom, you can get your pencil out and do it on your screen. If you put a line going up and down there, everything to the left is industries that are looking for declines in employment, and everything on the right-hand side are looking for increases in employment. The number has to do with the location quotient. So how many people do you have working in that in comparison to the national average, right? And then the size of the bubble gives you a chance to understand the overall relative size to the number of people working in the community. And then the last piece, if you look at the left-hand axis there, the average wage, the higher the bubble is, the higher the average wage is. So it gives you a kind of it's a fun chart to dwell on for a little bit, but I gave you text so that you can understand later what this is, because I'm sure you'll spend a lot of hours looking at this, probably not. But it gives you an idea of where that's going. And it's funny because I've been picking on textile and leather for years, because every county I go to has the same bubble and it's in the same spot. And it's just because you just don't do a lot with leather anymore. I don't know, in the 70s, right? Maybe there's a lot more leather craft. I'm not sure. I'm just going to let that go and leave that sitting there. Think about county GDPs, and trying to measure GDP by county is not the best thing in the whole world, but everyone likes to know this kind of stuff. So here it is. So we look at the 1-year change in GDP for San Juan County. You can see that the changes and the cycles to how that's evolved over time. And again, you can see the pandemic. It's really clear, right? Like, oh, okay, got it. And you can see the big spike up. And of course, we would expect to see a more stable, right? Over time, we expect that to be a little more stable. But then when we dig into what is contributing to that spike, real estate and rental leasing is the largest contributor, followed by accommodation and food services. And so again, we start painting the picture of where this kind of thing is coming from to work through.
Can I jump in on GDP for a second?
Oh, yes.
All right. So not looking at the county GDP specifically, looking more at national, what we saw when everybody started saying about 6 months ago, everybody's saying, okay, recession is coming, recession is coming. What we saw was 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, but it's coming off of this, right? I mean, this graph that James presents, extremely high rebound of GDP off of that weak year, some weak quarters followed by some really high spending quarters. When we had money circulating in the economy, we were spending it. So we had really high GDP, and then we had a couple quarters of declining GDP, but it's coming off of this extremely high GDP. So was that really a decline? Was it more of a soft correction? Again, it's really important to take that wide lens view. It's not just 2 quarters of GDP defines a recession. Well, okay, let's look at that broader context. There's a reason it wasn't declared a recession just based on that metric.
Right.
So, the story has been unusual. It's just the amplitude of changes over the past couple of years have changed the way that economists are looking at the data, because we can't just rely on this being, variations on a normal scale.
Well, you think about it, right? You have record unemployment, you have record employment, you have low employment, record low unemployment. You've got like all the other metrics are screaming like expansion, and then you have GDP shrinking, and everyone's like, "Oh, we're going to be a recession." What? Okay, you're looking at one thing. So be more diverse, I guess, is the lesson. We've got some general information slides for you here, and then we're expecting questions, right, Anneliese? Lots of questions. Anneliese gets all the hard questions today. We drew straws earlier. So I'm going to invite you to follow our research center on social media. We put out about 6+ things every day into social media world. news stories, reports, data, all kinds of fun stuff. Sometimes we post stuff we don't agree with and tell you why. So it's a great, easy way to kind of feel like you are following a larger view of economics.
All right, and I am with the Employment Security Department. We do not have a strong social media presence because government. But we are the source for a lot of data. In fact, everything that James was, a lot of the data points that James was looking at came from us directly or came from us indirectly, because a lot of other resources benchmark against our data. So we are where you're going to find a lot of source data on wage range information, jobs by industry, employment trends, labor force and unemployment, a lot of information at our website, and as well as BLS. So esd.wa.gov/labor market info. I've got the tab highlighted right here in red. I've also got a newsletter. I'll put in a shameless plug every single month just to keep me disciplined. I write newsletters for the regions I cover. Just basically a summary of what I'm seeing this month in the unemployment numbers and what I'm seeing in industry trends. If that's something you would be interested in subscribing to, just email me. It's anneliese.vance-sherman@esd.wa.gov, and I'd be happy to add you to my distribution list.
All right. That brings us back to the groovy title slide and all of their questions. That's right. Peace out. Oh, no. All right. So questions. Talk to us. Who has questions?
So could I, this is Chris Reed. Could I ask a question?
Please.
So one of the theories we've had over the last few years is that, as the county builds its communication infrastructure, such as fiber, would become more attractive to information and knowledge workers. Maybe they start coming up here seasonally and working at home, and then ultimately they say, hey, I can live here and actually do my job. Is there anything in the data which says that's actually happening?
I can take this. I'm going to just pull up some data right here. When we're looking year over year, we're seeing a really similar pattern with San Juan County to what we're seeing over the state. That is a slight decline in information and financial activities from 2019 to 2020, about 2.8% annual average drop, so barely anything. Then we saw an 11.4% increase from 2020 to 2021. So really similar pattern to what we saw statewide in that information workforce. Slight drop and then, a pretty strong growth after that. In 2022, we have seen a slight drop off of what we saw in 2021. Again, pretty similar to what we've been seeing statewide. So we are seeing that's one industry that has been pretty similar in San Juan County as well as the state. I'm going to let my dog out.
I was going to say, Chris, I would expand on that and just say it's what we have seen too, anecdotally from folks, is some people have made big moves and just assumed the employer would follow, with their move, and some of that's worked out and some of it hasn't. But a lot of people also have looked for lifestyle shifts, right? They have moved out of Seattle to, I'm going to pick on Woodinville now. They moved from Seattle to Woodinville because they wanted to have a bigger yard. They wanted to have a dedicated office space. They wanted more space, right, to do that. And so it gets complex pretty fast to understand why a particular person. And so from a demographics perspective, the tighter you can dial in with the kind of person you're trying to attract, the more likely you are to understand what their needs are and be able to promote those kinds of things. Like, I live on Camino Island, so it's another island, no ferries though. So I have that going for me. We've seen a pretty decent influx of number of people, and again, anecdotal, not real data, of people from Microsoft, because they are looking at having to go to the office 2 to 3 days a week, and they're willing to take that little longer commute for a little bigger of a yard, kind of a perspective. So again, just knowing kind of who you're going to be attracted to will help understand how we can track on how many might actually be thriving.
Okay, now that my dog is in the backyard, I'm going to add on to this a little bit and point out that, when we're talking about some of these large tech employers, we do see some layoffs happening right now, and we're not going to be able to quantify it right away. And in some ways, we might never be able to quantify it if severance packages do what they're supposed to do and keep them out of the unemployment insurance system. And, they're able to connect with work fairly quickly. But one thing I'm thinking a lot about is the question of, we're in this real-time lab right now with these large businesses trying to figure out, okay, do we keep our workforce remote? Do we bring them all back into the office? Do we bring them, part of them back into the office? What does that look like? And I think it's, we keep hearing plans and then we hear them rescinded. And a lot of that's because there's a really low unemployment rate and workers have more leverage right now. I'm really interested to see moving forward which of these employers do end up having, sending everybody back to work. It's going to be city by city. It's going to be large employers making that, executive decision, which will impact workers that decided to locate remote. But that'll also impact the decisions that are made by other employers that are in competition with or in the same industry with those key employers. So I think we're going to see kind of this patchwork of, what Seattle might not look like what Bay Area does because of the composition of employers and what that local ecosystem's expectations are. So I think that right now it's an interesting time, especially with the idea of remote work and what that means for San Juan Island or San Juan County. Are the employers that a lot of the tech workforce connected to going to be drawing them back to work or back to the workplace or not? Are we is this an ecosystem with a lot of smaller startups? A lot of different questions to consider and a lot of changes happening right now and over the next several months.
Thank you.
So we have a question in the chat here. So Gretchen, you're asking about the impact of Washington State Ferries, inconsistency, cancellations, how they would be affecting the economy. So when we think about impacts, we have to think about a change, right? So the first thing you have to assume is, and measure somehow, is what change there's actually been. Has it caused someone not to cause some sort of economic activity? Has it affected people to the point where they've made significant enough change where there would be an impact versus just it being inconvenient? And I don't think there's any good data source that would tell us that we have now, other than just looking at retail trade data and passenger counts, right? Because they do a pretty good job of counting. Coast Guard rules being what they are. They count people on and off. So have that the days when there's been cancellations, have we seen less people on the boats, less cars? Does that give us an idea if there's been some economic change that's occurred? And that would be how I would look at it. And it's not something I don't think Anneliese, I don't think it's something you've looked at either.
Not so much on the area of economic impact, but I do know that this is a workforce that is particularly challenging. And I've been sitting in on conversations at the statewide level with, hearing from the Transportation Commission, working with HR working with some people in the Department of Transportation, having conversations, actually one for Results Washington coming up, where the question about ferries specifically comes up, and the challenge that one of the challenges they're consistently facing is how do we replenish this workforce that needs very specific training and that is retiring in large numbers. So some of this is that long-term issue of retirement, but also compounded by some short-term challenges. And I guess I don't have any answer for that, but I do know that it's a question that comes up in a lot of conversations that I've been having around the state lately.
Thank you. I think that too, manufacturing is perhaps impacted with the ferries and the reasons they need to be manufactured in the state or are not being manufactured in the state. But for San Juan County, I think it's having a huge impact on people being able to actually even work island to island. So having to have a remote workforce or not having tourism happening at the rate because people can't get here. I mean, last weekend they couldn't get here, a 3-day weekend. A lot of restaurants were opened and inns were opened and reservations went unfilled. So I think it's a real sensitive point in San Juan County, and I'd like to see more information about that. Thanks.
Another question here, Anneliese. What are some of the policies being made or considered at the state level to address some of the concerns in labor and economic market for the state? And I don't have a good answer for this because I don't play in the policy world. I get to ask to evaluate policies, but I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, you know what? I know there are a bunch, and I'm just not picking them up right now. There are some very specific policies with regard to different occupations and things like that. But I do know that, broad picture, there's a lot of questions around this labor shortage issue affecting a lot of different industries, but in particular, a lot of questions around healthcare. How do you help to build up a workforce that has very specific credentials associated with it? It's not something where transferable skills say, well, you're kind of like you're kind of like an RN. We'll plug you into this job. We'll train you. There are some very, very strict gateways into healthcare occupations. And so I do know that there are a lot of questions circulating, not that there's policy about, letting people that are like an RN become an RN, nothing like that. But, a lot of questions around how to build out these pathways. And in some cases, funding associated with that. But anything specific, I've got a spreadsheet that I could access on my Teams channel, one of my Teams channels, but I don't have it right now. But suffice to say, there are a lot of conversations happening right now.
I can tell you that we are engaged with a project that the legislature asked us to work on last year, and it's in motion this year. We're looking at retail pathways to understand and help the retail sector better understand and support progression within the retail space, so that they're able to retain more workers within the industry. And so we're evaluating leakage and where people kind of fall out and what could be used to support people in retail very early on in that. So I don't have much more to say than that. But I can't tell you about bats in the margarita supply. Bats help with agave, which is one of the big ingredients in margaritas, well, at least good margaritas. And there's a problem with the bats. So bats are being impacted by climate change, which are impacting the agave, which is going to impact your margarita, amongst other things. And again, I want to highlight, it gives me a chance to highlight commodities, right? Because you don't think about this, like, why is canola oil more expensive? Well, it's because Ukraine produces most of the world's sunflower oil. Okay, well, you're a company that uses sunflower oil in production and you can't get it. So now you buy canola oil. Canola oil now has more price pressure on it. We're back to those basic charts out of econ, right? The demand goes up, therefore the price has to go up because the quantity is somewhat fixed. And we're seeing that on a global scale. Wheat's got the same problem as the agreement with Russia not to blow up the cargo ships leaving Ukraine with wheat in it expires March 9th. And there's strong speculation they are not going to renew that. And so wheat futures started rising yesterday because of that. And so again, the commodities market is where if you think you can lose money in the stock market, you can really lose money in the commodities market really fast, because everything moves very, very fast, very dynamically, and a lot of times nonsensically, that it just doesn't track. And so the commodities market has been fascinating to kind of watch and try and use that as a barometer for what may be happening around consumer opinion, and understanding why consumers are behaving the way they are. Because you all are weird people, consumers. You do a lot of weird things. Any data on how access to worker housing is affecting jobs in San Juan County? Housing, Anneliese, do they have housing problems? Isn't that's an outlier, right? That only is a couple places with housing issues.
Oh my gosh. There's housing data, there's worker data. There's very little that actually, directly connects the two. The answer anecdotally everywhere is yes. There is impacts to worker housing affecting jobs in every area that I cover. But the nuance is slightly different in each area of what that looks like. And of course, in San Juan County, a lot of it's that question of seasonality associated with that as well. As far as really directly having data that's going to answer that, no. It's a complex environment, but we can certainly look at plenty of metrics, and I can certainly guide you to some of those metrics, largely census data that will kind of describe issues such as, at different tiers, what's a typical rent, how constrained are people with rent, what are the number, we can look at population numbers, we can look at housing numbers and kind of figure out what that looks like as far as person per housing unit. But it's a complex situation, and one that we can certainly use data to help parse out and figure out, but that's a project. So not so much a data source issue.
And we're engaged in doing some research around ADUs, so accessory dwelling units, and there's two kinds, right? There's the shed in your backyard, and then there's the room you can't attach to your house that's is like a miniature apartment. I love making these stuff make some sense. So you have ADUs, and HOAs have policies around ADUs, and so we were asked to look into what those policies are and if that might help with some of the demand for housing. And again, we're still fairly early on in that research. But realistically, at a county level, this is comprehensive plan stuff, right? So thinking about how your county's comp plan is dealing with zoning and housing is really important, because the way that works, for those of you that don't, play bingo with the county council a lot, the state drills down population growth around the state into the counties, and then that dribbles into, if there's cities within the county, the city gets a piece of that as well. But that gets allocated around the state. And then your county has to have a plan on how they will accommodate that increase in population. The opportunity for the general population is to really inform those comprehensive plans around what type of housing, how, where, and thinking about what might be needed. Is it more multifamily, for example? Is it more single family home, but small lots, so they're more affordable, right? We use words when it comes to housing that actually don't mean what we think they mean. Like we talk about affordable housing. Affordable for whom, right? If me and my spouse both work at Microsoft, we have no kids, affordable housing looks very different than somebody who works down at the corner store, right? So slapping words like affordable on things doesn't actually help define the population very much. So you have to think through how do you put those pieces together, and then it becomes a public policy challenge around what do you do for the people that have occupations that are somehow not going to afford that housing. Like what kind of public policy do we need in place? And all of that a lot of it can be dealt with at a county level, which is kind of cool to think through that. So again, those are great questions to ask. And I think that there's, Anneliese has got great employee level data, employment data, but what there needs to be is a better connection between the public policy side on how do you allocate that out so you get what you want as a community.
Yeah, I guess one other thing that I'm thinking about, specifically looking at the data and thinking about San Juan County situation, you do have a lot of workers that live on the mainland most of the year and then come to San Juan County for work in the summer. And right now the unemployment rates are really low everywhere. So they don't have to leave Snohomish County or Skagit County or King County. They can find a job fairly easily where they already are without incurring the cost of finding an apartment and everything else in San Juan County. So right now, with unemployment rates as low as they are, that's one other moving piece, just like if you go to the store and you want pork, but you buy chicken instead, if you've got a lot of job opportunities where you are, you might not be looking at other areas that are more remote because the unemployment rate's low and I don't have to move seasonally. So that I think that's also something to consider, is just that context in the regional context as well.
So Diane Martinsdale had a question that she sent to me. Diane, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Let me make sure you're still in the room here with us. Oh, there you are.
I am in the room.
Hi.
Hi there. What a great job you all are doing. Thank you. As we look at downtown Friday Harbor, we see a sea of empty storefronts. So as I was looking at the slides on retail, those restaurants are gone. And I've seen tourists struggle to find places to eat, and this impacts our previously really high visitor satisfaction in coming to our island. I think that absent landlords or investor landlords get a tax break, and they can just leave their buildings empty. And we're concerned more than myself. If there is a way to require landlords to have a certain level of occupancy, a way to get them to care about the bleak look of our downtown as much as the residents do. That will eventually, and I believe, is impacting tourism.
You know, some developers have that. Like, I'm going to use a strip mall. Diane, don't be offended. I'm going to use a strip mall as an example and say there's like nothing about San Juan that says strip mall. But some of the strip malls have requirements they impose. The landlord will impose that they have to have open hours and have it look occupied, et cetera, right? Which can lead to some very creative answers by some tenants to make that happen. I don't know. I don't have any great examples of, and again, this is outside of Anneliese's and I world, but that's a public policy question, right? Can the city require, you know, much like Leavenworth requires certain facades on businesses, can San Juan County impose some form of rule that, you know, that does that? Or can in like Mount Vernon, the downtown association for years worked with empty property owners to do different things in their storefronts to make it look more optically pleasing. They had displays and they had different things and come up with different creative ideas. So, but you're absolutely, I can tell you that you are correct there. I mean, as if I own a piece of real estate, I can deduct the loss, right? I mean, it's not a credit. I'm deducting the loss. So it's not really there's not a gain to it from an investment perspective, but it's certainly muted to some extent. So there can be some unintended consequences to federal tax law. I'm not aware of anything in state law that would be beneficial to having a space be empty. And in fact, your insurance goes up astronomically if you have an empty space. So there are disincentives as well for those spaces to be empty. But sometimes it's just the community getting creative and talking to those landlords to try and come up with different ways to use that space in a way that will encourage the long-term tenant they really want.
Thank you.
I get to step out of my economist box and be the management consultant from time to time. So. What other questions? We've got some links going on in the chat that you can definitely look at for some internal reports that have been done in the county. Victoria, is there anything you wanted that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure that we?
Thanks for asking. You know, as always, you guys have done an amazing job covering basically everything I wondered about. So thank you. And I hope that everybody got your contact information during this event. But if you didn't, we'll be sending out the recording along with Anneliese and James's contact information. Are you guys all set for what you'd like to say? If so, okay. I want to give a big thanks to Anneliese and James for coming today. It's been wonderful to see you this year as it has been in previous years. And we're very grateful for your time and your expertise, and always encourage people to reach out to them if you've got questions. I want to say a big thank you to Marty, Jillian, and Linda from the EDC team who helped put this event together. And as always, a big thanks to our EDC board. Today we've got Steve Hushbeck, Amanda Azus, and Chris Reed, and I don't think I missed anybody here with us today. And the work that they do to help move the EDC forward and us as the team forward is always greatly appreciated. So thanks to our board. And thank you to all of you who came today. We're always excited to have a nice room full of people with great questions and insight, and thanks all around.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, James and Anneliese. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.